I'm Kelly Yang, and I'm the author of Front Desk, and I'm also the author of Three Keys, the sequel to Front Desk. I'm in San Francisco in the Bay Area here in California, and I'm in my bedroom. So Three Keys is a sequel to Front Desk. Front Desk, if you guys remember, is the story of 10-year-old Mia Tang. She's a new immigrant from China. Her parents come over to the US with her, and she finds herself managing the front desk of a motel while her parents clean the room. And this was very much based on my experience growing up as an immigrant child, helping out at the front desk while my parents cleaned. We worked in 3 different motels, and front desk is a really, loving and funny and kind of emotional story. It's exciting because you want her to do well, but she has a lot of hardship and setbacks in her life. But Mia is a fighter, and she always goes for her dreams, and she tries really, really hard. And Three Keys, the sequel to Front Desk, is the continuation of the story. At this point, Mia has purchased the motel from Mr. Yao, the owner, along with all of her friends, her best friend Lupe, Hank, who is a resident in the motel, and a lot of different immigrants and investors. And she's running it her way. She's finally on the good roller coaster now, and she's going to run it with her best friend Lupe. Except that this is 1994 in California, and there's a governor's race that is very, very heated between this guy Pete Wilson and Kathleen Brown. And the governor wants to introduce a new law. And this law is a real law that happened here in California called Proposition 187. And it's a law that, if passed, would make it illegal for undocumented immigrant children to attend schools and to go to the hospital. And actually, it was one of the most frightening laws that I ever went through as a kid, going through the whole experience and watching all of the ads on TV and seeing how everybody felt about this law. And a lot of Californians were very supportive. And so you had a huge wave of racism and anti-immigrant hostility that was happening all the same time. Mia's trying to grow up and trying to go for her dreams and trying to find a way to help her community, a way to help her friends, and a way to go for the American dream, in a place that is kind of becoming a little hostile towards immigrants. So she has to find that courage and bravery in herself and use her pen and use her voice to speak up and to stand up for what's right. So the 2 roller coasters is something that Mia's best friend Lupe came up with when she was trying to explain America to Mia back in the first book, Front Desk. And she told Mia that there are 2 roller coasters in America, one for the rich and one for the poor. And it's something that, I think really was a big part of my life, was trying to figure out as a kid who was, having a really hard time, being able to live in a stable home and not have to switch schools all the time, and being on free lunch and all these things that I grew up with, and having no health insurance, is constantly worrying, like, when are we ever going to get on the good roller coaster? And it's a concept that, I think a lot of kids will really understand. It's definitely a struggle in this country, have means to survive and to go for opportunity. And opportunity is not always available for everyone. But what I think the great thing about Front Desk and the whole series is it teaches people that, we do have the power to speak up. We do have the power to be kind and to embrace our community and people that we have so much in common with, and, to really embrace that love and that camaraderie, and come together as a community to go for our dreams. I've always wanted to write a sequel to Front Desk because in my mind, the story was not over. I wanted to see what happened to that family, what happens to Mia as she gets older and she has to deal with, her friends at school, and also people finding out what she does for a living, which is she lives and works in a motel. And that was always so terrifying to me growing up as a kid. I never saw that reflected in books or in movies and TV shows. So I always thought that where I lived was really not normal. And so I always wanted to hide it and keep it a secret. And in Three Keys, Mia's biggest secret is revealed to her class because somebody in her class finds out that she actually does live and work in a motel. And so she has to deal with the aftermath of having that truth be revealed. But just to give you guys a hint, it is not the end of the world. And in fact, becomes a really interesting turning point in the story. And the other thing that inspired the book was living through Proposition 187. I mean, this was a very painful part of my childhood. It was very real. Even though my parents and I had, documents, we were here with papers. But in my mind as a kid, the difference between having those papers and not having those papers anymore was simply going to INS, the Immigration Naturalization Services, which is this big building in LA, and then it's all over the place in San Francisco. And waiting in line. Every year we would go and wait in line to get our visas renewed. And my mom would always say to me, look cute and don't say anything and don't do anything that is going to make them not give us that visa, smile, try to look like a good little immigrant, whatever that meant. And it was terrifying, standing in that line. And it was always cold because you'd have to go at the crack of dawn to get a spot. And you'd go at 4 a.m. to wait in that line. And as we inched closer and closer to the big immigration officer, my heart was just in my throat, just going, oh God, what if he doesn't approve us this year? What if we get denied? And so in my mind, there really was no real difference between lawful status and unlawful status, just because I knew how easy it was to take that lawful status away. So when Proposition 187 came along and threatened to take away immigrant children's education and our ability to access healthcare, it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever gone through. And to see all my friends and I worried about this constantly while all the other kids speculated. I mean, this was a huge, PR campaign in California. There were ads blasting every day about undocumented immigrants and illegals, they would call them. And it was so terrifying to watch that, to go through that. And then at school, a lot of the kids would be constantly speculating, oh, I think Kelly's illegal, or I think so-and-so's legal. And then this was just such a, seared into my memory. It was tattooed into my brain as a kid growing up, that I knew one day I would have to write about it. And I finally have in 3 Keys. I think that to me, ingenuity, and especially American ingenuity, is all about the difference that one individual can make in your community. And I think that it is so important right now as we're going through COVID-19 to think about creative solutions. And Mia is a kid, and she doesn't let the fact that she's a kid, or that she's still learning English, or that she doesn't live in a big house, and she doesn't let any of those things stop her. And she doesn't always have the most money, and she doesn't always have all the advantages in life, but she tries really hard, and she tries to use her voice, which we all have. And she tries to use her pen, which she's still learning how to be a writer. But she tries to use all those things to affect change in her community. And most importantly, to be a good ally and to be a good friend. And that to me is really what ingenuity is all about, is how can we help each other out, not just make our own lives better, but to make the lives of everyone around us a little bit better. And that's something that Mia does. And she learns the 3 keys of friendship, which to me are also the 3 keys of allyship, which is you got to listen, you got to care, and you got to keep trying. I think that all kids can make a difference. And if you see an injustice, you need to speak up about it. You might not think that your one voice will help, but it absolutely makes a world of difference. It makes a difference to the person who's experiencing that injustice, the person who has done the injustice, and just hearing those voices echoing and understanding that there is a lot of people who are willing to stand up for what's right. It makes us feel less vulnerable. And so it makes a huge difference. And it's just something very simple that we can do, which is that we can just use our voice. And I write about this in my YA parachutes. Your voice is your armor. And I really believe that. I really believe that. And I think it's something that we need to empower kids to do at a very young age. So I wouldn't be here without librarians and libraries. My parents were struggling first-generation immigrants, and they didn't really understand English. They didn't really know how to help me. Luckily, I always went to the library in my community and also the school library. I was really fortunate to have a school library pretty much in every school I went to. And I'm a huge advocate for school libraries and libraries in general, because the librarians that I went to see, they took me under their wings and they said, hey, you know what? I have a book for you. And they wouldn't stop talking to me about books to the point where I gave it a shot and I picked up book after book after book. And then I would discuss it with them afterwards. You know, they cared about what I had to say. They cared about what I thought about these books. And even though at that time the books didn't represent me because I hardly ever saw an Asian American in a mainstream children's literature book. But still, the love of my librarians, you know, they saw me. And so it was sort of like step by step, book by book, that I fell in love with English. And I found the confidence to be able to be a writer. So I wouldn't be here without libraries and librarians. I am so thankful that we have the Library of Congress and we have so many wonderful libraries in our community. And I want to fight every single day to make sure that they are well funded, because I am living, walking proof in the power of libraries to change lives. When I was a kid, I often wrote about places that I'd never been to, about a life that I didn't have. You know, I would write a lot of stories about living in a big house with a dog, which I didn't have. Thankfully, I have a dog now. But I always wanted to be someone else because I thought the way I lived was not normal. And it really took a lot of things. It took me, you know, understanding that there is no normal American narrative. You know, we all come from different walks of life and we all have different stories to share. And the most interesting stories are the stories that are authentic. And so it was really finding that authenticity, finding the courage to be authentic, that really made me open up. And that didn't happen for me until later in life. I would say probably in college. And even after college, it took a really long time. And I actually, in fact, originally wrote Front Desk for my son, who was only 8 at the time. And he had no idea how I grew up, because the way I grew up was so different from the way that he grew up. You know, and he grew up like, you know, in a normal house and with like a dog and all these, you know, he didn't have to worry about going to the Goodwill to find clothes. Like I would take him to Target or whatever. And so he had a really different life than the way I was raised and the way I grew up. So when he was 8, I thought to myself, like, I better tell him, because if I never tell my own kids, you know, what does that say about me? And so I took a huge leap of courage, a leap of faith, because I didn't know how he was going to react. And I didn't want him, you know, I didn't want him to be embarrassed by it, but I also didn't want him to feel sad for me, because I had joy as a kid. Like if you read Front Desk and you read Three Keys, you'll see there's a lot of joy and fun in these books. You know, I had a fun childhood. It was really fun. So I wanted him to experience all of that, the whole package, you know, the hope and the optimism and the joy and just the silliness of growing up, but also the real issues that we had to face. And we had, you know, a lot of real issues, like, you know, not having a turkey for Thanksgiving, which is very real. And like, you know, not having all the fancy toys, not having vacations, never having a vacation. It was really hard growing up. But I wanted to put that in with a heavy dose of hope so that he would have that empathy in him towards all people from all different walks of life, all different ethnicities, and be able to understand more about the world, which is really what the Front Desk series was all about. And when I took that leap of faith, he loved it. At the end of that summer, I remember he came back from camp and he was like, "Mom, you have to do something with that story." And I said, "Well, what am I going to do about it?" And he said, you have to sell it. You have to like, let me make copies and sell them to my classmates." And that's when I realized, you know what? First of all, I better get a literary agent, but also that it's really amazing what can happen when you share the truth and when you are not afraid to put yourself on the page. So my final message for kids is never give up. If you like writing like Mia, keep at it. Keep going to the library, keep reading, keep writing, even if you're making mistakes. I made a ton of spelling mistakes, a ton of grammar mistakes growing up. But trust me, it'll get better and it'll get easier and it'll get funner. So just keep at it. Keep learning, you guys. I know we're going through a rough time right now, but I believe in you and I'm here for you.